Good morning. We're truly blessed this morning to be able to hear from Dr. Judy Dean, Professor of Economics at Brandeis University. Judy's been my colleague in the work of the Association of Christian Economists, as we both serve as editors of the journal Faith and Economics. In the 25 plus years I've known her, I've always found she combines the technical expertise of a trade economist with a genuine passion to help the poor, driven by her deep Christian faith. Judy graduated from Gordon College, for whom she now serves as a trustee. She earned her PhD in international economics at Cornell University and spent some significant time doing research for her dissertation, living in India in some very challenging circumstances among the Dalit, the poorest people in the caste system. Professor Dean has taught at Bowdoin College and at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. I've been very impressed over the years with her labors with Christian college students who've come to do graduate work in D.C., as Judy's ministered to them in both in economics and through her work in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship on another board in which she served. Judy is just very adept at her craft, as seen with her work for the International Trade Commission on trade policies, the environment, and developing economies. The Wall Street Journal just recently posed the question, does helping the planet hurt the poor? If you want to know more about that question, you're invited to come hear Professor Dean speak on it at Hieronymus Lounge at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Professor Dean brings research expertise as a board member of World Relief and a consultant to the World Bank. And though she's going to invoke the topic of rock and roll this morning, beyond all this, she has a wonderful operatic voice, which she uses to sing Mozart and Bach. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dean to Westmont.
Thank you. Wow, Ed. Wow, I think he just made me larger than life. I don't know. It's great to be here amongst all of you. I was just telling your Ben Patterson here that when I think of chapel, I think of small and intimate, and this is like explosive, big, but it's good. It's good to see you all. All right, I'm glad you all came in for such a title, Rock Stars, Famous Economists, and Global Poverty. How do we really make a difference? If anyone sees or has plenty of this world's goods and sees his brother in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Let me say that again. If anyone has plenty of this world's goods and sees his brother in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? This may sound like a line from the Washington Post, or maybe a report on NPR decrying Christians for their hypocrisy, for saying we are all about helping the poor, but basically doing nothing, or for preferring to hang on to what we have rather than giving it to others. But it's not. That statement is a statement by the Apostle John, writing to the church late in the 1st century AD. Listen to how he puts this in 1 John chapter 3, starting from verse 16. He says, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. If anyone has this world's goods and sees his brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth." If we needed any encouragement to have compassion for those less fortunate than ourselves, this is it. The Bible rings out with God's compassion for the poor and with our responsibility to help out of the blessings he has given us. But John's words pierce right to the heart. Christ saw our need, though we were totally undeserving, and he gave his life for us. We're called to show that kind of love to our brothers and sisters. And one obvious way to do that, as John says, is to lay down some of our material goods to help the needy. You know, John's example is even more powerful than it sounds in English. I looked up some of the words in that verse, and the word for sees, as in sees your brother in need, doesn't just mean a passing glance. It means someone who has seen and understood fully the need of his brother and has no pity. might be better understood as feels compassion, but closes his heart and does nothing. So John's talking about someone who sees, understands, appreciates the depth of need, who even has compassion welling up inside him for the depth of need, and then does nothing about it. So this is a real call to action for us. But how do we help? What do we do? I'm sure there are many of you out there who would love to help, would love to do something to help. But there are many voices that talk about helping the poor, and when I look out there, a dizzying array of policy prescriptions that are tossed around. Bono, the One Campaign. Any of you have ever been to the website, taken a look at what Bono is arguing for? He's got some good stuff up there. He calls for the U.S. to allocate an additional 1% of the U.S. budget, that's where the one comes from, toward providing basic needs, debt cancellation, trade reform, anti-corruption measures. The list goes on. And while many of those could be good, much money has been thrown down at these problems over many, many years, and the problems are still there. Yes, there has been tremendous progress in reducing global poverty. In fact, tremendous progress all over the developing world, with the exception of Africa, actually. But more than 1 billion people still live in what the World Bank defines as extreme poverty, even after all the progress. Then there's Jeffrey Sachs, famous economist from Columbia University, who was on the cover of Time magazine in 2004 with his book, The End of Poverty. In that book, he outlines a plan to end that extreme poverty by 2015. Oh boy, we're in 2011. It's a long way to go. But he's calling for governments to work together to boost agriculture, improve basic health, invest in education, improve supplies of electricity, provide clean water and sanitation. Again, a long, long list. But William Easterly, also a very well-known economist at New York University now, formerly of the World Bank, he reminds us that, as he says, large-scale crash programs, especially by outsiders, often have unintended consequences. He also notes that simple dreams at the top can run afoul from insufficient knowledge of the complex realities at the bottom. So who's right? How do we know? How do we here today make a difference faced with expertise where people are disputing even though they're brilliant economists, faced with long lists of policy prescriptions from people like Bono and others? Who's right? In thinking about this for a long time, I have decided that the best way to find the right answers is to learn to ask the right questions. Now that's hard because asking the right questions requires humility, requires a willingness to learn, and it also requires hard work. I learned some of my most important lessons in development economics while living in India, completely outside the classroom, completely outside any formal economics education. I learned them when I was buying a rug and riding a motorcycle. First, the rug. I'd been in India about 2 weeks or so, and I was a brand new economics professor teaching at Bowdoin. So of course I had no money, no furniture, no rugs. And someone said, oh, there's a great place to buy rugs, and you can buy them much cheaper than the US. So I said, take me there. I'll bring back a rug as my souvenir. Well, I came out of the rug store, the proud owner of a small but very nice rug, all wrapped up and ready to go take back to the United States. Now you have to picture Connaught Place in the middle of New Delhi. Connaught Place is an old British kind of look to it, very fancy shops where only the tourists seem to go. And when you walk in, they sit you down with a cup of tea and just roll the rugs out in front of you. You feel like you've become a prince or a queen or something just walking in the door. But the reality of India is outside the door. And as I came out carting my rug, there was something on the sidewalk, but I really couldn't tell what the something was until I began to see that it was a little boy. He was so twisted and deformed that it was hard to make out who he was, but you could see one little arm sticking out with a hand. My heart just sunk. My rug cost $200, which in the US is close to nothing for someone with a regular salary. I mean, for me as a brand new professor, that was a huge lot of money. But in India, as my co-author, who's Bengali, would tell me, it would buy the moon. And I stood there thinking, oh my goodness, what do I do? Maybe I should just take the rug back and give the money to this kid. But would that help? Who was this little kid? Why was he on the sidewalk? There was no one there, no adult anywhere in view. And I had already learned from many of my Indian friends that there were networks of people who would actually take kids, even their own kids, and purposely maim them and put them on the sidewalk in order to earn money. If I gave money in that situation, I would be hurting him more, not less. But I didn't know. Was he one of those victims, or was he really in need and I should give him money? Should I take him to a hospital? But where would I go? And wouldn't that look like kidnapping if I scooped up this little kid and started running off with him? That wouldn't look too good. I'd already learned how notorious the Indian police were. I didn't want to go there. Should I pay for his help? But how do I do that? Where do I take him? What's wrong with him? I didn't even know where to start. Here I was with immediately $200 that I could hand right to this child, and I could not help him. It was a horrible feeling. The motorcycle ride. Eventually, I hooked up with World Vision while I was in India, just to go and visit them, see their work, see what they were doing. And the fellow who was in charge of the work in that particular office in New Delhi said, come with me next week, I'm going for a ride over to Kalyanpuri, which is a big slum in the northeast part of New Delhi. I hate to tell you that, but the slum is still there, and this has been many years now. So there's a lot of good work, but the problem is still there. In Kalyanpuri, one of the big issues is that both husband and wife tend to be looking for work and out of the small household. These are people who have usually come from villages from far and wide around the city where there's been drought, and so without any crops coming, they go into the cities to just squat, basically, put any sort of shack up that you can live under and look for work. But if both parents are away, you've got lots of kids with no supervision. So what happens is you get a behavior where the adults pull the little girls out of school. Schools, by the way, are free for these people. No, they don't even pay taxes for them. But the girls get pulled out at 7 or 8 years old to look after the littlest kids. And then usually the girls never go back to school, ever. Now, why would that be a problem? Well, some of you might feel it's a problem right away on the surface, but it might be a deeper problem than you think, because in development economics, one of the things we have more evidence on than anything else in the world is that one more year of primary school for a girl, specifically, has bigger benefits for development than almost any other policy you can implement. So having this behavior where girls are pulled out of school has serious consequences far beyond the one child. And while I was riding along on the back of this motorcycle, which, by the way, is a feat in a skirt, side saddle, where you can't hold on to the driver because he's not your husband. Think about that one. That was an interesting adventure. The guy driving the bike, he says to me, oh, so what World Vision is doing is we built a daycare center. And I'm thinking, what? We're in the middle of Delhi. We've got people so poor they can't even buy a couple of bananas a day. And they're trying to feed 6 kids. Oh, a daycare center, what good is that? It sounded to me like a very Western concept plopped in the middle of India. But I was wrong, because I didn't know the people he was trying to work with, and I didn't understand their poverty. Like the little boy, I didn't know who they were, I didn't know why they were poor, I didn't know how to approach the issue. And he very patiently explained to me that not only that this problem that I've just described to you created really 2 big needs. One was to keep the girls in school. The other was to try to have supervision over the infants and the very, very small children. The daycare center allowed them to do both. Knowing that the smallest child was well watched out for, the girls could stay in school. Meanwhile, at the daycare center, the littlest ones were taught alphabet, language, writing, hygiene, things like that, which they actually took home to their parents, which helped the parents, had a spillover to the parents. So it was a marvelous solution that addressed all these different angles of the poverty question that were happening in that slum. You see, what I hadn't understood was that this poverty problem in this particular slum was very complicated. It had a lot of interactive parts to it, and you couldn't just fix one part without addressing the others. So from those two lessons, I guess I would tell you that the right questions that I've learned so far are, who are the poor? Why are they poor? And how will this project or program that I'm looking at correct the root cause of their poverty? Not a symptom, but the root. Get at the root. Those are my three questions. Who are the poor? Why are they poor? And how will this particular project or program that I'm thinking about maybe supporting or getting involved in correct the root causes of their poverty? So can economists who purport to study this offer any answers? Can we help with those three questions? Well, I think we can offer a little bit of help, so let me try. First, who? Who are the people who are poor? Even though people differ across all countries and across even districts within countries, economists have found that there are some characteristics that pretty well describe very needy people, whether you're in India, Africa, or the poorest parts of Brazil. That is that poor people tend to be, in these countries anyway, rural, self-employed, often in agriculture, or in very low-skilled, labor-intensive industries such as electronics, textiles, shoes. They have little education, little property, little land, and they spend a large share of their incomes on food, clothing, and housing. Those are sort of general characteristics that are true throughout the world. What about why? Why are they poor? You can imagine there are many, many causes of this problem. But the World Bank has come up with about 3 broad categories, or baskets of causes, if you will, that I think are pretty helpful. The first is low incomes and few assets, one of the biggest causes. What they're trying to say there is that the jobs these people have, or the return from their farming, tends to pay them very little. So it's a very low income stream, a job that generates a very low income stream. They have little physical assets such as land, cows, other animals. They have little human assets such as education. Secondly, lack of protection from corruption. So for example, if a family goes into debt because the father has fallen ill and can't work, the debt comes from a moneylender, which can easily charge interest rates in the hundreds or thousands of %. And what often happens is the person never gets out of debt. So you're back in a cycle of grinding poverty. Why? Because you had no alternative. The corrupt moneylender was your only choice. And then third, vulnerability to shocks. That could be a flood, an earthquake, but it could also be an illness that pushes the family over the edge into poverty. So 3 broad categories of causes: low income and few assets, lack of protection from corruption, and then vulnerability to shocks. What about the third question? How? How does this program or project that I'm considering supporting get to the root causes of poverty? Or another way of putting it is, what sort of solutions should we be looking for? Well, let me suggest 3 examples of solutions that I think have a lot of evidence that show that they're really working because they go to the root causes of poverty. Microfinance is a good one, although there's a lot of discussion about its results, and some people say the jury is still out. I have seen some of the work, say, of World Relief in Africa. I've been to its work in Rwanda and Mozambique. And a good quality microfinance program really can work well because it's getting to one of the causes, the root causes. In particular, that number 1 I mentioned, lack of assets. It's helping people who don't have any venture capital acquire capital to expand their businesses. So providing assets that can then have fruitful, long-term income-generating consequences. Secondly, freeing people from indentured servitude. IJM does this, International Justice Mission, another great organization. Some of you may be familiar with their work. They go in and free people who have been cast into poverty and long-term debt with moneylenders. Because in many countries, this kind of indentured servitude is actually illegal. but the law isn't enforced. Why is that effective? Well, because it's dealing with corruption. It's actually getting to that second cause, the vulnerability to corruption, and the problem that poor people often have no other alternative, no recourse, but to go to the corrupt solution for money lending problems. IJM not only gets people out, but tries to help offer solutions, offer other alternatives that are law-abiding for these people. And then thirdly, I would say addressing the consequences of AIDS, particularly in places like Africa. World Relief is very involved in this as well. I mention them a lot because, as Ed mentioned to you, I'm on their board and I have great respect for what they do. Just to give you an idea of why that's crucial, think of a microfinance bank. Think of what happens when this bank works a bit like a credit union, so it's a accountability group where the loan is to the group, and each member of the group works together to help the whole group pay back the loan. But what happens if one of those women gets AIDS from her husband that was traveling outside the village maybe and came and brought the disease back to her? Oftentimes that person can no longer work. Now there's a problem in the community bank. Now there's a problem in the microfinance group, and the whole loan may collapse, especially if you have more than one individual with that problem. Just another way of showing you the complexity of the poverty issue. And World Relief has a lot of programs that come into that situation to try to address the disease, the suffering of the person, and the income consequences simultaneously. That's an example of addressing vulnerability to shocks. Now, those are just three. You could find many, many more examples, but these are examples that I think are good because they're solutions that go to the heart of the poverty issue. They're going down to the roots of the problem for many people, and they're trying to design a solution that fits with who the person is and why they are poor. I think our attitude toward the poor is a reflection of our attitude towards God. He calls us to respond to those who are in need. But global poverty is a complex problem, and so are its solutions. Good stewardship means asking the right questions and working hard to find the right answers. We really do need to know who we are trying to help, why they are in the poverty situation they're in, and then how we can really design help that will address the root causes of their poverty. I think more than anything, this requires humility, a willingness to learn from those we come alongside to help, particularly, and it also requires prayer, much prayer. I'd like to close with just a quote from a woman I met in Rwanda, in Kigali. I was with World Relief touring people who had received roofs and windows made out of steel from World Relief. This was right after the genocide, so 1997, just a few years after. And many people live in mud houses, as you might know, so without the steel roof and the steel window, the house will disintegrate in the rain. So World Relief was providing these and helping rebuild homes. So I met Christine. Christine lived in a one-room mud house, the neatest looking house you've ever seen, well swept. I don't know how a mud house can be clean, but it was. It was remarkable. She had about 5 of her own children. She was a widow from the genocide. And she had, as she would say, 5 orphans. Whenever you asked anybody, how many kids do you have, they'd say 5 plus 5 orphans. What they meant was they took in 5 other kids who were left alone as a result of the genocide. So she was alone, barefoot, in a one-room mud house with the responsibility to support 10 children. And we were praying for her with a local pastor in the local language, which is Kinyarwanda, and he was translating for us. And Christine said at the end of our prayers, "Thank you for the roof, thank you for the windows, thank you for everything that World Relief has done, but mostly thank you for your prayers. Everything else is secondary." I hope we can have that kind of a heart as we approach this problem. Thanks.